of nonstop UFC continues as the Octagon has made its way to San Jose, California. Coming up, one of the world's best middleweights, Mark Munoz, comes to Northern California riding a 4-fight win streak. But Chris Weidman is steadily climbing in the division. This top prospect hasn't lost in his pro career. Will Munoz leave his mark, or is it Weidman's time to shine? This is the UFC Weigh-In Show on Fuel TV.
You're looking live inside the HP Pavilion. In just over 24 hours, two of the top middleweights in the world will look to solidify their place in a crowded 185-pound division. And there is Mark Munoz riding a 4-fight winning streak. He's looking for the next shot at the Spider. But standing in his way, his opponent, this man, Chris Weidman, with a victory, he would move to a perfect 5-0 in the UFC. Who can catapult themselves into title contention? With that, we welcome you inside the Shark Tank. I'm your host, Jay Glazer, alongside my man, Chael Sonnen. I gotta say, I've been kind of looking for you for the last year or so, and what you been up to? Haven't heard from you, nothing.
I didn't say anything. I had a match over the weekend. It's
Really?
not odd that you didn't know. I didn't really promote. I didn't really do anything to let people know. But we had a fight.
Really? How'd that work out for you?
Yeah, not so hot,
No,
actually.
huh?
Thanks
Yeah.
for bringing that
Yeah, no
up,
problem.
Jay. Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but since you did.
Hey, we're going to talk about that much later in the show, also on tomorrow's pre-fight show. Folks, while you're watching us, make sure you tweet us your thoughts using the hashtag Fight Night. Also, follow us at Fuel TV. Now let's kick things off with tomorrow night's main event right here on Fuel TV. Because he just fought Anderson Silva, Anderson now needs a new opponent. Can it be one of our guys in the fight tomorrow night? Let's start off with Mark Munoz.
Yeah, well, listen, Mark Munoz absolutely, not only could he go with Anderson, he's got the skills to beat him. And what's very relevant and unique with Mark is he's trained Anderson, not trained with, he trained Anderson. Anderson stuck him out. Mark is a national champion Division I wrestler from Oklahoma State. He's extremely powerful, Jay. He's competing competitively in MMA at 12 pounds less than he did in college.
And you see those big Donkey Kong punches. But the guy he's facing, this man, Chris Weidman, he's no slouch when it comes to wrestling also.
This is another Division I All-American out of Hofstra. He's with the Sarah Longo camp. He's 4-0 in the UFC. He's 8-0 in MMA. If he can make this 5-0 inside the Octagon tomorrow night, it will be very hard to argue how he is not the #1 contender.
Well, with a little bit more on Chris Weidman and Mark Munoz, I now want to bring in the third member of our broadcast team, our guy, Ariel Helwani. Ariel.
You know, Jay, despite the fact that Matt Serra and his coach Ray Longo told me 2 years ago that they had a young guy at their gym named Chris Weidman who would someday be a UFC middleweight contender, Chris told me yesterday that even he's surprised by his meteoric rise in the UFC. This is a guy who in a year and a half is 4-0 in the UFC and legitimately 1 or 2 big wins away from fighting for the UFC title. In order to realize those lofty aspirations, though, he needs to get by Mark Munoz tomorrow night, a guy who was supposed to fight Chael Sonnen in January until an elbow injury forced him out of the fight. He said he was deeply depressed after hearing the news, cried for several days, but then a few months ago, he made it his goal, his #1 goal, to show to the world that in a very crowded UFC middleweight division, he is the man who deserves to fight Anderson Silva next. Jay?
Well, Chael, why don't you answer that question? Which one of these guys match up better against the man you just fought this weekend?
Chris Weidman is very long for this weight class, and that's really rare. That's something that Anderson Silva really has, is some really good height, really good length, and Weidman would negate that.
Right.
Weidman, but Mark Munoz is extremely powerful and worked out with Anderson Silva. And when you have that kind of direct insight, because Anderson has a real mystique about him, a real aura that's very intimidating, the mask is off when you've trained with the guy.
Right. He's not going to lose at the scale because he's already helped coach him, as you said earlier.
Exactly.
All right, folks, that's it. Chael and I, we're going to stick around for the rest of the show. But when we return, we will send it down to our guy, John Anik, who'll be on stage and with the mic next. Don't go away. Weigh-ins are live when we return.
What's up, San Jose? How about a warm welcome? Ariane Celeste is in the building. Our UFC matchmakers, Joe Silva and Sean Shelby, and the inimitable B-Dub, Burt Watson, is here as well. These are the weigh-ins for the UFC Fight Night on Fuel TV. We begin with a prelim, yours on Facebook, tomorrow at 5:45 Eastern. Our first bout in the bantamweight division, Rafael Assunção versus Issei Tamura. First fighter to the scale, Issei Tamura. $135 for Issei Tamura and his opponent, Rafael Assunção. $136 for Rafael Assunção. All right, our next bout in the welterweight division, Marcelo McGraw Guimarães versus Dan the Anvil Stidgen. First fighter to the scale, Dan Stidgen. $170 for Dan Stidgen and his opponent, Marcelo Guimarães. $171 for Marcelo Guimarães. Our next bout in the middleweight division, Rafael Sapão Natal versus Andrew Craig. First fighter to the scale, Andrew Craig. $185 for Andrew Craig and his opponent, Rafael Natal. 186 for Rafael Natal. Our next bout in the flyweight division, Chris Kamikaze Carriazo versus Josh Taz Ferguson. First fighter to the scale, Josh Ferguson. $125 for Josh Ferguson. And his opponent making his flyweight debut, Chris Carriazo. $125 for Chris Carriazo. And our final prelim in the bantamweight division, Damasio, the Angel of Death Page versus Alex Bruce Leroy Caceres. First fighter to the scale, Alex Caceres. $136 for Alex Caceres. And his opponent, Damasio Page. $136 for Damasio Page. Now to the main card for the UFC Fight Night on Fuel TV, 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 here in San Jose. In the lightweight division, Rafael Dos Anjos versus Anthony the Assassin Njokuani. First fighter to the scale, Anthony Njokuani. 156 for Anthony Njokuani. And his opponent making his 10th UFC appearance, Rafael dos Anjos. $156 for Rafael dos Anjos. Our next bout in the bantamweight division, TJ Dillashaw versus Vaughn Lee. First fighter to the scale, Vaughn Lee. $135 for Vaughn Lee. And his opponent, TJ Dillashaw. $136 for TJ Dillashaw. Our next bout in the middleweight division, Carlos Vemela versus Francis Limitless Carmon. First fighter to the scale, Francis Carmon. $187. $186 for Francis Carmon. And his opponent, Carlos Vemela. $186 for Carlos Vemela. Our next bout in the welterweight division, Aaron A. Train Simpson versus Kenny Robertson. First fighter to the scale, Kenny Robertson. $170 for Kenny Robertson. And his opponent making his welterweight debut, Aaron Simpson. $171 for Aaron Simpson. Our next bout in the light heavyweight division, James Tahuna versus Joey the Mexicutioner Beltran. First fighter to the scale making his UFC light heavyweight debut, Joey Beltran. $205 for Joey Beltran. And his opponent, James Tahuna. $205 for James Tahuna. And now for our 5-round main event in the middleweight division. Mark the Filipino Wrecking Machine Munoz versus Chris the All-American Weidman. First fighter to the scale, Chris Weidman. $186 for Chris Weidman. And his opponent, Mark Munoz. $186 for Mark Munoz. Here's your main event tomorrow night in San Jose, Chris Weidman and Mark Munoz. Thank you all for coming out today for continuing coverage of the UFC weigh-ins. Make sure you're watching on Fuel TV. Chael Sonnen will address his fighting future. We now send it over to Jay Glazer and Chael Sonnen. Fellas.